I'm going to, I'll wait for that. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is the City of Lake Forest Park City Council regular meeting Thursday, March 12th, 2026. And I've asked Councilmember Saunders to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you'll stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Hey. So the next item is the adoption of our agenda for this evening. I think there are copies on the back table for our members of the audience. Does anybody have any amendments to the agenda? All right, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to ask, do we want to identify that we're going to be having a continuation of budget discussion
Oh, yeah.
for those? So if we can add that under other businesses, and I will have to amend his motion. So I second your motion. Since we're in the middle.
Okay,
And I'd like to amend the budget or the agenda to put continued budget discussion under 10 other business.
sounds good. I guess, so the motion is to add this amendment. I
Yeah.
I think basically there's, okay,
Second.
yeah, there's a second. All right, little irregular, but we've done it. All right, so, all right, all those in favor of adopting the agenda as amended, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so next item, we have a public comment period. So I think we have our list, yeah. Thank you, Commander. All right, we have two people signed up. I think I'll call Sally Yamasaki to the podium. Oh, you're both together. Okay, and Sarah Phillips.
We want 6 months and we'll see. Oh yeah, there's a table that goes.
Hello.
Yeah.
So first we kind of came here partly because we heard Josh was going to be inaugurated. Anyway, become part of the Parks Commission. And we thought that was pretty cool. And just are so pleased with Full Pine. In fact, we just came from there. Okay. Anyway, and how much Josh really supports all of our community things. We couldn't be more grateful to him. Now, the other reason why we were here too is we wanted to talk about something, which is when we were doorbelling this year, mainly for Prop 1, there was so many times when we went to the doors and it was so clear that the people in our community didn't know what was going on in our town. They knew more from next door what was going on than they did from the actual people, the voices of you. The other thing is when we had the League of Women Voters panel where you all were up there and you talked about what you did, and then we could ask questions about some things and you gave answers. It was so informative for all of us. As a result, a group of us have been in a lot of thinking that it would be nice to have something like that happens regularly, that we could have a town hall where all of you could come and talk with us, and not just this one directional way where we're just like talking to you and you just like going like this, but again, where we can have somewhat the same format. We can learn about all these things you're working on, which again is amazing. I didn't know Ellen was working on, Perkins Way and all these different things. I'm gonna take too much time. Well, so anyway, so we're hoping that we can create something where our community, not up here away from things, but we'll know about, and you can respond.
So we sent an invitation out, sort of a hold the date for it's May 20th in the Commons to do a town hall meeting. And we're really thinking that
that it's really a chance for you to tell us what your hopes and dreams are for the city of Lake Forest Park. But also one of the things that we've heard from people is they have no idea about the kinds of things you do as liaison to the commissions and to regional organizations, to WIRA 8, to the Salmon Board, to the Association of Washington Cities. And our notion is that it would be an opportunity for you to share that as well, so people had a better and broader understanding. And then mostly it would be questions and answers where we had some, and we're thinking that there'd be a moderator probably from out of town. And then that the notion would be an opportunity to talk to us and for us to answer back. So again, the date is May 20th, and we'd like to know if you're coming. And we're working with a group of a coordinating committee of most of the local organizations to so that they would send it out in their newsletters and notification. So we wanted to extend the invitation and hope you come, and we're going to have a good time.
And because we're going to begin publicity soon, if you could let us know whether you're available, it'd be nice to be able to list your names on that as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you. All right. Those are the two people who are signed up for public comment. Are there any other people in the chambers who are interested in making public comment? I also realized that I didn't read the usual disclaimer we have to read. So, but the point is we're not taking online comments. So I think that's the only other people. Okay, seeing none, then I'm going to close public comment. Okay, final confirmation. This is the fun part. Okay, so I'm going to call. Is somebody going to introduce our? Okay, fair enough. All right, I'm going to call Josh Anderson to the podium. This is appointing Josh Anderson to the Lake Forest Park Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, position 6. And so thank you once again for volunteering for this position. I think citizen commissions are some of the most important aspects of our city. You know, that's really basically the boots on the ground. So if you have like an opening statement, please feel free to tell us.
Yeah, I think Corey wanted to be here to introduce me today, but she cannot. So my name is Josh. I'm a business owner in Lake Forest Park. I own 2 businesses, the Vulpine Tap Room and the Borough Cafe. On the upper lot, just up here in the town center, I've seen some of you through, so some of you know about us. If you haven't been, come on up and say hi. But I've lived in Lake Forest Park for about 10 years, kind of moved around from Ballinger Way, and now I live proper just up here, up what I call the Goat Road, which is a little windy road that goes over the hill. So thank you for inviting me to the position and for having me.
All right. So, Council, do you have any questions for our appointee? All right. Councilmember Riddle.
It's the question we always have to ask. What's your favorite park?
You know, I've got a few answers to that, but I think the park of interest is the park. I did a walk through a park today before showing up, so I look a little bit wet. It's the little Blue Heron Park down behind the town center here. When I have thinking to do at work, I usually walk through that park and do my thinking there. It's just a little loop, but I like to go through the loop. So
Thank you.
It is a wonderful park. All right, Vice Chair.
Thank you very much for volunteering your time. I guess my question is kind of big picture. What would you say your top goals are for the Parks Board to accomplish this year?
yeah, you know, coming to the Parks Board, I spent some time talking with Corey at events that I helped with. You know, our coffee business assisted in some of the city events around Lake Forest Park last year. And at Vulpine in the borough, a big thing that we take pride in is building community around events and artistic collaborations and bringing art to our community. You know, we're a really artistic community in our space. And I think coming to the city this year, I hope to give input and assist with maybe planning some events coming this summer. Looking to engage in some of those artistic avenues. I heard there's some collaborations happening with murals in the park, and there's some cleanups happening. So just looking to engage, I guess, where I can add value in some of those areas where we already participate at Volpine and do well in.
Thanks. Love that. Anyone else? All right. Councilmember Rosno.
Always good to see another Josh here.
Yeah.
And I was on the Parks Board before I was up here, so it's always, thank you for stepping into that. And I know you've done a lot of really great work at events in the parks, and I wonder if you can just share any insights or any thoughts on things that we can be as a city and in the parks sphere specifically to sort of strengthen those events and strengthen the parks beyond that.
Yeah, I've lived in Lake Forest Park or around Lake Forest Park for about 10 years. And, after joining the Parks Board or looking to join the Parks Board, I was informed that we have many parks throughout the city, and not all of those are well known. But the parks that we do have that are big enough to throw events like I believe it's Animal Acres Park is where we did the music last year. Increasing public awareness around those parks and coming up with some new creative ways to bring in people from our community and provide for Lake Forest Park, but also reach out to neighboring communities and make people aware that we have these parks. We want people to come to them. We want investment in the park and to improve those. So I guess looking for opportunities to do more and do something different. I think in 10 years, we haven't seen too many new events at the parks, but I think in the last couple of years, we've started trying to throw more. So I hope to see more of that.
Councilmember Muhlenberg.
I want to return to the subject of community building. You brought it up. Our guest speakers, or whatever you call them, guest speakers. We'll call you guest speakers. They brought it up as well.
Public comment.
Thank you. Public comments. You talked about it, Josh. Do you have thoughts in this city where we have a lot of very dedicated community members that are involved all the time, and then we've got a very big city where we don't get a lot of engagement from the rest of the city? Have you thought about how to bring those people in, what those barriers might be? Do you have suggestions for us on what can increase that participation?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I think maybe thinking up ways, Lake Forest Park over the last, even just 5 years, we opened our business in 2019, just post-pandemic. And there's a lot of change in the demographic of the people that live here. And I think maybe considering that we have new members of the community that have different interests. We have people asking for things that we haven't had asked for in the past, and maybe organizing some events and brainstorming some things that would bring in that younger demographic that represents a lot of the new parents here that live in the city. Maybe some of the engagement that we're not seeing from those families comes from us not engaging in ways that they're interested in engaging with, or reaching out to them on the platforms that they're used to engaging with. And there might be different ways to make those families aware of what the city is doing. I think that's something that I share with some of the public comments is, unless I come to City Hall or unless I talk with somebody who sits on council, sometimes it's hard to know where in Lake Forest Park to go or what is happening for some of these events. Our biggest struggle with some of the events we ran last year is really just outreach and awareness. So maybe having a place on the website where people can see events, or thinking up new ways to engage with the community with your outreach team. But I'm here to hopefully help with that and give any insight that I can.
Thank you.
And I think everybody's running around the horn. Okay, Councilmember Riddle.
Real question. Hearing your sort of love of art, have you ever considered doing like an art walk in one of the parks? Would that be ever something you would ever want to take an endeavor on?
I think it's something people would certainly be interested in. At Volpine, and I shouldn't just say Volpine, but at the town center with some of the business owners and partnerships that we've done in the little lot and the little space that we have access to, we've thrown art walks. And there's usually pretty excited engagement around that. People love coming out to that. They love seeing it. And yeah, I think an art walk in the park would be great. I think with the right people in charge of it and the right outreach, you could probably see a pretty good turnout.
Anyone else? Okay, all right, chair's privilege. I can't think of basically a better person for the Parks Board. Your businesses are some of the most welcoming and inclusive spaces that we have in the city, and so really proud to have you work with us on this. And just the fact that basically you're so versed in the art world as well as, of course, the recreation world, it makes you, I think, pretty uniquely suited to basically bring us to the next step, especially since we have the Lakefront Park coming online in a couple of years here. All right, so I'll entertain a motion.
I'm moved to appoint Josh Anderson to the Parks Board.
Second.
All right, any further discussion? All those in favor, please say heck yeah.
Heck
Heck
yeah.
yeah.
Heck yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay. So we also have the pleasure of having, and I do apologize if I mispronounced your name, Hina, okay. Hina Shahid to the Lake Forest Park Planning Commission, position 7. Welcome, and thank you again for volunteering. Would you like to make an opening statement? Oh, actually, did you want to introduce? Okay. All right. All right. So do you have an opening statement?
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Hina Shahid, but it's fine. I'm used to pronouncing new names too, and it always the first time for everything. Yeah, I have lived in Lake Forest Park. Well, we are one of those people who came middle of pandemic and moved out of other areas, Seattle and other places, and moved here in Lake Forest Park. And we're raising 2 children here. We go to local schools here. So it's very much part of our community. I'm also the co-founder for Always Summer Ice Cream Cafe. Today is our 1st year anniversary. So we completed 1st year. So I'm really happy to be part of this community, not only as, thank you, not only as residents, but also as business owners. So I think it really is a unique opportunity really to like live and do business in the same place. Your neighbors are also your customers. And I think like that whole community aspect is what is one of the things that drives me to be part of, engage in the city. And I'm really looking forward to doing that. I haven't ever served in a planning commission before, but I have served in various design organizations. So my background is in design. So I have a master's in interior design, a master's in design management, and I sort of like do both these things today. I worked at a tech company more on a product design side, and I also have my design consultancy, which is my own practice. And so sort of like combining all of these aspects, I think like for planning commission, that really puts me in a position to be able to like see things broadly, as well as, really consider like when we talk about meaningful city growth, when we talk about, having cities with meaningful growth. And that's something that I'm really, really passionate about. So really looking forward to engage.
Well, thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to open this up to council. Okay, Councilmember Riddle.
Thank you. I love your background.
Thank you.
I come from a similar type design background, not master's though.
But architecture.
Architecture, yeah, and then to construction. So
Yeah.
who knew?
There are a lot of people who say this thing, you couldn't be an architect to become an interior designer. So it was one of the things that was missed opportunity for me.
Well, there's a lot to be learned from that. You
Yeah.
have to listen and you have to absorb and you have to compromise always, but you have to keep your vision in the forefront as well in these sort of design experiences.
Yeah.
And to hear you speak in those similar terms, I think that you'll be an amazing asset to the Planning Commission. I also joined the Planning Commission when I had a young kid because I wanted to be part of the community she would grow up in. And I love that you've got roots here that you're building, and I think it's going to be a really awesome things coming from you from the Planning Commission.
Wonderful.
So thank you, Hannah.
Anyone else? Nope.
So I was at Always Summer just yesterday, no, 2 days ago. My 13-year-old had a band concert, and so afterwards everyone wanted to go out and get ice cream. So there we were, and I saw your husband running in to try to relieve the staff, I think,
Yes.
behind the counter.
No, it's
As things
usually middle
build
of the
up.
dinner rush that he has to do. Yes.
So, but I mean, it's so great to have those sorts of third spaces. Obviously, we were talking about Third Place Commons and the those sorts of semi-public, privately owned spaces, shops like Always Summer really provide that too. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, through the Planning Commission, through other city work, how we can expand those sorts of spaces and make more of them available through the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think even, like both for Always Summer, right? Like for me and my husband, we're both designers. And like part of the thing has been about like food is an experience, the space is an experience, but community is another experience. And so we've tried doing a lot of like little things on our own, but I think like we have to like go and do some collaborations beyond. So we do a lot of collaborations with Third Place Commons. We are going to be doing a lot more movie nights. We started doing it for children. So like this is a place where like we have a space and it's raining outside. Where are you going to take your kids? Like let's just come together and then do that. So we started during Christmas time. We'll continue that in another couple of months. We do a book club, open to public, free for public to just come in. We collaborate with Third Place Books on that. Like part of their authors that come up, they also come downstairs for book club. So we like tried to do a lot of these like physical experiences. And I think since pandemic, we're all being starved for that. And as like newer technologies start to come in and we're like all day spending our time on screens, we do miss that human connection of like being together. And we also have a very interesting opportunity in Lake Forest Park where we have a town center. There are no more cities that are coming up, that are building actively a town center and building around it. There are very few cities, even, in the greater Seattle area, which has that affordance. And then we have the affordance of having the commons as a space that everybody could come and be together. And it's not necessarily a commercial space only, right? It's a very community space. So like having a lot of like these sort of like events like movie nights. We also, this is our first year. So last summer we did a kickoff and it was our summer kickoff. And we did see a lot of people come in. We had a local band come in and, like a lot of people. So we want to do like our version of a block party, right? Like it's like Lake Forest Park Town Center block party. So like gradually doing a lot of collaborations with other merchants as well to sort of do it more of a town center wide thing. So it's become like our thing. And I know Vijay speaks to Josh a lot. So hopefully like, again, like a lot of collaboration where we could do, maybe we do artwork, maybe we do, like a beer and ice cream, like we could just like a crawl sort of a thing, a family friendly one. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to do that. And I think it's because we have a thing called a town center. And it also has a space within it, which is free for public. So yeah, there are a lot of things that we could definitely do there.
Yeah, thank you so much for volunteering your time to be on the Planning Commission. Something that you mentioned and also you put in your application is talking about economic development in the city. And I know historically Lake Forest Park has been very residential focused. And so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on how we can broaden out economic opportunities for residents in the city.
Yeah. I think one of the major trends for Lake Forest Park is, of course, town center. And it is not 100% occupied, by the way. We also have other commercial zones, which are, like they're not as many, I would say, retailers out there. There's not enough like restaurants. We all sort of feel that, right? Like after a while, you sort of like have to like go to another city to maybe like grab dinner because you've kind of like had same place like 3 times, 4 times a month. So there's definitely opportunity to do that. And we do have like high traffic zones that have just become high traffic zones where like it's a great opportunity for it to like be more commercial. So yeah, I think in terms of like growth opportunity, there is. Yes, we are very residential, but I think like the fact that there is a city center and you can grow around that center. And then we do have certain corridors which are like high traffic. And so there is definitely an opportunity for us to do more. Example in a lot of like we see certain communities within Seattle as well where you'll see that it's very like small town feel. It's like a own neighborhood, and it has a very small town feel, and they have like a local spaces to go to. And then you go to another neighborhood and like they have like their own feel going on. So we're kind of like a neighborhood that a Seattle neighborhood would be in some ways. So I think again, there is an opportunity for us to grow because we do have like these overgrowing like commercial corridors, like, Ballinger, we have this hole on the highway. So there's opportunity for us to do that. But again, like we do have a town center, and I can't say enough that there's so much development that could happen within that. We still don't have like it fully utilized yet. And then there's also opportunities like public spaces there that we could do a lot more and engage a lot. And I think like Josh mentioned about like the engaging with the younger crowd, or like the younger parents, like the newer population that has moved in the last 5-6 years. And so there's a lot of stuff that could happen around that.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much for volunteering. I do apologize for mispronouncing your name. And I really want to thank you because as you've probably seen from the work plan for the Planning Commission, they've got basically the transportation element, they've got the critical areas ordinance, and those are the required bits. So the fun thing you guys get to do is housing affordability. So there's a fairly heavy play, and I'm always amazed that anyone steps up to that, and I really appreciate what you do. And the fact that we got 2 business owners to basically be part of our boards. This is a voice that's critical in our community. And I really love seeing that. So thank you for volunteering. At this time, I'll entertain a motion to.
I make a motion to appoint Hina Shahid to the Lake Forest Park Planning Commission, position number 7.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say heck yeah.
Heck
Heck
yeah.
Heck yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, wonderful. All right, and continuing on that air of good feeling, we've got a proclamation about recognizing March 2026 as Red Cross Month.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Whereas the American Red Cross has been dedicated to serving people in need since its founding by Clara Barton on May 21st, 1881, and we honor our neighbors who make its humanitarian mission possible. And whereas every day their acts of kindness change lives, bringing relief, comfort, and hope when help can't wait. This compassionate spirit runs deep in our community, just as it has for 145 years through the American Red Cross. And whereas today, those who serve in the Northwest region light the way during emergencies, whether it's delivering shelter, food, and comfort after disasters, providing a safe, life-saving blood supply for patients, assisting military members, veterans, and their families with 24/7 global support, or empowering individuals with skills like first aid and CPR that save lives. And whereas these collective efforts are a powerful reminder that the strength of our community lies in our shared commitment to one another. And whereas we celebrate our local heroes and resolve to continue lifting each other up so no one faces an emergency alone. And now therefore the mayor and the city council of the city of Lake Forest Park do hereby proclaim March 2026 as Red Cross Month in the city of Lake Forest Park and encourage all residents to reach out and support its humanitarian mission.
All right, thank you very much. And are we doing a presentation? Okay. We will be presenting this proclamation to representatives of the Red Cross later. So thank you. Okay, moving on then. We have our consent calendar. Anybody want to make a motion?
So moved?
Okay.
Second.
All right, so it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, so all those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, and I want to mention that, yeah, this will be interesting because we just also approved, of course, the traffic unit, and it'll be interesting to see how that's implemented, how it turns out. So, thank you very much, Commander. Okay, ordinances and resolutions for action. We have Resolution 26-2066, authorizing the mayor to sign a second amendment and extension to the professional services agreement with SAFEbuilt Washington LLC for municipal building services coverage. This is the second touch. And Director Hoffman.
Thank you, Mark Hoffman, Community Development Director. This is second reading of the proposed resolution. We didn't have any homework questions to come back and provide answers to, but short summary is this extends the SAFEbuilt agreement one additional year through March 2027. Increases the not to exceed number for another year, additional 120,000. The rates are also amended slightly, not drastically, not significantly, but you have the original agreement and the rate sheet in there. And I'm available for any questions you might have.
All right, council. Okay, Councilmember Riddle.
Just confirming that this extension agreement is flexible if we were to find a building official that we would hire in-house?
The goal remains to have an in-house, full-service building official similar to the past. If that were to happen, I would say it mirrors our original plan. We did hire a building official, and she was employed here for 4 or 5 months, and then chose to retire. In that time, we were never able to fully transition inspections and plan reviews. So that's why SAFEbuilt is still fully tasked. The plan was to have this agreement in place to cover vacations and so forth. So that plan won't change. Longer term, though, we would like to RFQ for a backup building provision services when the need isn't so urgent.
Thank you
But
very
for
much.
the next year, we would like to retain it for backup and not use the not to exceed amount.
Anyone else? Okay, so I will entertain a motion. This is the second touch I want to mention.
And a reminder on the urgency of this.
Originally, we thought 3 touches through March and we would be fine. My worry is that it's because of the vacancy and so forth and the frequency that we're getting building permits in, at some point, the invoice and the not to exceed number will cross likely at the end of March. So I would appreciate having an agreement in place, but we certainly could wait till the 26th.
As this seems that there is some time sensitivity and not a whole lot of controversy from the dais, I would like to move to waive the 3-touch rule and open formal debate on Resolution 26-2066.
Second.
Okay, so this motion is to waive the 3-touch rule. It is not to approve the resolution. All right, so all those in favor of waiving the 3-touch rule, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed or abstaining? Okay, thank you. All right, so continue.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that we don't have a building official and we have the need to carry out these tasks still. And so we need to have this, whether it's in-house or through a contractor. And if you're concerned that we might cross the reimbursement limit before we're able to approve this at our March 26th meeting, it seems like it would be relevant to approve it tonight. It's basically a foregone conclusion that if we don't approve it tonight, it'll be approved on March 26th. But since it seems non-controversial, I would be okay with approving it tonight.
Would you like to make that
Well,
official motion?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're having
Oh, we're
debate.
doing
I
it.
figure once we've had debate, then I
Okay.
can move the actual resolution.
Um,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I don't want to put us in a sticky situation. This has been non-controversial. It's our second touch and we've done an amendment before. It's just the same thing. So we've seen the context before. So I'm happy with putting it to motion tonight.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't gotten public comment on this. We haven't gotten, there hasn't been much back and forth last time either. So, and obviously it's working for you. It seems like it's working for the city. So I don't see a reason not to move forward sooner than later.
All right, thank you, Councilmember. Somebody else?
And I know how busy you are. He really needs it, so.
Thank you.
All right.
So if there's no other debate, I would like to move that we approve tonight Resolution 26-2066, authorizing the mayor to sign a second amendment and extension to the professional services agreement with SAFEbuilt Washington LLC for municipal building services.
Second.
Okay. Somebody seconded. That's great. All right. So, all right. I think, is there any further debate on this? Seeing none, we'll go to the question. All those in favor of approving Resolution 26-2066, please say aye.
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 Anybody opposing or abstaining? All right, passes unanimously. Thank you, council.
Thank you.
All right, so what do we have? We have no new council discussion and action items as far as I know. We're going to go to other business then and talk about the budget stabilization. Well, not just the budget stabilization fund, but all the other attendant budget items that we were talking about at the work session. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Budget and Finance Chair Riddle.
Perfect. And in general, I would like to suspend our more formal approach and be in a more informal discussion approach with the council, if the council concurs. I've got unanimous consent. Thank you. So we were discussing before we came upstairs how to determine what our reserve should be set at. Should we have a floating number for what is in the reserve, and how does that balance with the purpose of the budget stabilization fund? And Josh, I think you were making some comments, and did we hear all of your comments downstairs? We had to kind of come upstairs, so I want to make sure we heard you.
I think the only thing I was going to add is just, in my head, there's a logic to, if we know that there's going to be a structural deficit built into the biennial budget, that maybe using, in my head, it's been the budget stabilization fund, but something as this is what we know is going to have to be committed. And then there is some amount of break glass in case of emergency. And then there is if something exciting and wonderful happens, those are the buckets that in my head, and we have 3 funds, so that works out possibly. But that's just how I've been thinking about it. I am the most junior of us here, so I defer to everyone else.
No, I think that's a great comment.
So,
Chair, Vice
yeah,
Chair.
thank you very much. And I just wanted to kind of, here's the synthesis that's coming in my mind. I'm trying to commit, everybody, I think we're gravitating towards the same thing, which is to say, we're all comfortable with sort of a 90-day reserve because as Chair Riddle said, we're not going to not get revenue, but we might get half revenue or something like that. That's a really bad case scenario, in which case we need to last 6 months because that's when the tranches of money from the county come on the property tax, which is our major revenue source. So having a 16% reserve means that we have a 60-day if everything were to stop, which is 4 months if we were to go to half rate. So I like your argument that basically if we had the reserve be that 60 day, and to get to the 90 days, which would give us the 6-month cushion, adding that extra 30 days, the other 8%, as it were, to the budget stabilization fund, there's a lot of merit in doing that.
Or council contingency, or
I think budget stabilization I'd like because council contingency has a lot of strings on it, I believe. So, yeah.
Any other comments?
Yeah. So right now we're at our rules say that our budget reserve minimum is at 16% of our revenue.
Correct.
And so we're having discussion that we may raise that percentage, my understanding. So we may raise that to some amount after we're going to develop. We have a worksheet that has been developed where we can put in the actual budget reserve amount that we have now, and then that will allow the percentages to be entered into the spreadsheet, so we can see where that's going to end up. Is that how I'm understanding it?
Yeah, but there is a nuance to that. Yes, the 16% I believe is in our rules, literally. Okay. But if we want to go higher than that, we could literally change that percent if we wanted to.
Yes.
Or we could use the budget stabilization fund to put that extra amount that we think we need in there. That was the thought that I was having. And that way we don't have to change the percent that's in our rules. The budget stabilization fund just happens to have that extra amount that we would feel comfortable with. So there's two ways to go about this.
Okay, and then the target reserve. So there's a reserve minimum, but then there's the target reserve that's because we don't operate at the minimum. Just, I'm saying this for people out in the ether too. We don't operate at the budget reserve minimum. We operate above that. But when we had the purpose of the levy discussion before, it was too fuzzy as to what, the minimum, the reserve target. So we're trying to define those terms and those amounts by this process.
Yeah.
And so that's the other part of the discussion, not only the reserve, and is it a reserve of the revenue, or is it of expenditures? Because or is it at the, whichever is greater? I think that's an argument that needs to be checked by legal maybe, and our finance director needs to have a buy-in with, or some sort of guidance on that.
Everything I've been hearing with the council, what the consensus seems to be is that we want to base the amount in our reserves on how much we're spending. How many days or how many months of expenses do we want? So it seems that I would be very much in favor of changing our policy so that the reserve is based on a percent of expenditures, not a percentage of annual revenues. In terms of, do we want to say 24% in the reserves versus 16% in the reserves plus 8% target for the budget stabilization fund? I don't really have a very strong opinion either way. I like the idea of having 90 days, whether it's 90 days in reserves or 60 in reserve and 30 in the budget stabilization. I think it accomplishes the goal. So I'm okay with either of those.
I have a process, kind of a process question. And that is, so we're going to have a minimum, we'll have a target. And at what point does the money go into the stabilization fund? Is it if it is over what the target is, or if it is, I'm not clear when that money gets put into that stabilization. It seems to me that it would be after, if you're over your target, then that amount of money would go into the stabilization. But I'm not understanding how
Yeah.
that,
If I may.
yes.
So I think we're hearing there's sort of two patterns here. One is that we keep the reserve how it is, and it's a 60-day, 16% reserve. We can talk about revenue or expenditure, but it's going to be that goal. And then to get it to a 90 days of coverage, we have the stabilization fund. And so it's almost like the stabilization fund acts as the canary in the coal mine before we hit a catastrophic moment. It gives us a cushion to bounce against before we start hitting the reserve. And we know when we got there, by the time we get there, we've got some problems. The other is to just go ahead and say 90 days in the reserve is, we just want that stability to make sure that we always had 90 days as our reserve. And then we can change our policy to read that. And then we would have a different metric for how to determine what is in the budget stabilization fund. So I think those are the two structural patterns that I think I've been hearing from the folks here on the dais. John?
And I had also, if I understood correctly, Director Vaughn's point that changing the minimum then opens up through audit or through other policy, like there is risk there that if in the course of things we drop below that just through the normal course of events, that changing that threshold formally opens up risks that just setting a different target and putting more aside, but not designated, but not setting, and maybe I'm misconstruing the conversation.
I think that I think it was the two funds that's where there's more constraint around how those funds are used, not the minimums. But
Director Vaughn?
It is directly tied to the minimums that we would want to be careful in the financial management policy stating a minimum. And then I liked the language if minimum, then that's what we would then be audited to for the accountability audit. So that's your minimum amount that you are held to, but with the desire to hold more money. If you state it like a target and you use the appropriate language along those lines, then you're not held to that if you do dip a little bit below that target percentage within that fund.
If I just ask a clarifying question there,
Absolutely.
like, is what you're saying is if our reserve threshold is 24%, that amount has to be in the general fund? We can't have some of that in the budget stabilization fund or the strategic opportunities fund?
Great question. And it all technically does, I don't want to go too deep into this, but yes, they are all technically the general fund.
That's what I thought. So as long as the totality of those accounts exceeds the 24%, the audit concern that you're raising
Yes,
wouldn't be flagged.
yes.
Another question, but that 16% was established many years ago, so it's feasible that if we needed to change the percentage and we made it official, then that would become the new minimum percentage. So it's not stuck at the 16%. It could be changed to a higher percentage if we just have to take action on it.
That is correct.
Okay. Yeah. And also one more thing, sorry, and we should probably do some more public outreach and maybe put out something that what we're thinking about so people can come in and comment.
I think when we have something they can comment on, absolutely. Vice Chair.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a stab at the other one since we have that one other thing, the Strategic Opportunity Fund. And I like how we've neatly divorced these two discussions because they are, in my mind, independent as well. So the Strategic Opportunity Fund, as a reminder, is the fund that we keep so that when a one-time opportunity comes up, the city can sweep in and sweep out on it. And so it's mentioned in the work session, the last time we used it was for the Lakefront Park, where we were able to leverage I believe it was $500,000 into the purchase of that property, which was a remarkable deal. So in that spirit, I think $500,000 would be a reasonable amount to put into that fund.
And so just from a historical standpoint, I think that was two different bienniums. They put 250 in because that's what we had available to us back at that time. I think now with the kind of the buffer of some of that CARES ARPA money, I think it makes sense to submit a bit more into that fund. And things cost more now. Are there any thoughts around $500,000 for the Strategic Opportunity Fund? We're kind of switching topics, but I want to see if anyone else had a follow-up comment. Oh, yes.
So when we were just talking about the budget stabilization fund, we had a kind of a clear metric of an extra 30 days. I don't think there's really a clear metric for the Strategic Opportunity Fund. And so in lieu of that, I echo Deputy Mayor Furtani's point that our last benchmark was how much we spent, and it was $500,000 to acquire the lakefront property. Really good deal because we got $4.5 million out of county and state funds. So we only had to pay 10%. But for lacking a better metric, I think $500,000 seems like a good target to aim for.
And that fund doesn't have any restrictions if we want to add money to it at a mid-buy or whatnot, if we feel like we have a desire to do so, because that's we get to choose what goes into that. So I'm hearing 90 days. I'm leaning towards there being a clarification of whether that's a full 90 days in the reserve or the 60 days of the reserve as we have now, and then 30 more in the budget stabilization. Having a floating target for the reserve plus having a budget stabilization fund, I'm not sure how we would use both of those. Like, how would we determine what goes into each one? Do we go into budget stabilization only after we've funded the 90 days? to the reserve target, and then any additional money we still had available would go to the strategic opportunity fund? Would it be like overflow? I guess that's just I don't know. I'm trying to think about how, do you have a thought, Director
Yes,
Bond?
I'm going to refer back to exactly what it states in the code right now, which is, and as the finance director, I would be very careful to do this throughout the year. However, at the end of the year, once you have all of your cost allocation done, et cetera, then you see where it goes up and down, and you use that budget stabilization fund to balance in the actual general fund, which is what it states right now within the code. So you'd be just using it in a truer sense of the intention of when it was originally created.
So if we were eventually in the future flush with money, we could do the reserve and keep the stabilization fund like lower because we have, but we can make that decision. And so you're thinking of the budget stabilization fund being more operational? You know,
I'm referring
keeping us
back
through those
to,
bumps by
so-
the year.
I apologize for speaking over you.
Okay.
So I'm referring to at the end of a fiscal year, if there is any delta of that, there's basically your operational, your revenues exceeded your expenditures because you were able to minimize your expenses for whatever reason, or you had salary savings, which hurts because it's being picked up by other people. I mean, the work doesn't go away, but other people are stretching to do it. But if there's one reason or another that you have savings, then that would swing, and then that would be transferred into the budget stabilization fund. And that's how mechanically, if that's what you're referring to, we would go about moving that money.
But then the reserve fund, we would say, this is how much it has to be, and that always just comes off first when we're talking about what's left. It's just always protected until we need it.
There isn't actually something called a reserve fund, though. We have
Yeah, it's reserved.
we have a reserve threshold, so I don't know that conversation is a consistent thing. It's just a matter of which account are we choosing to put those monies in. The code as it's written today has a very clear definition of how we can put money into that fund. We've not been maximizing that over the past number of years. I think the first thing for me to be able to effectively have this conversation, the first thing I would want to see is how much money would we have to put in that fund if we were to explicitly comply with the language that exists in the code today. And then once I'm aware of that, that opens up for me the dialogue of, do we need to adjust the 2% in here to accommodate for having up to a 90-day buffer in that stabilization fund? So I'd like to see some math before I really take this conversation further, because absent numbers, it's vague to me.
Yeah, I think it would be reasonable to use the 24-25 budget and see like what is that percentages that are in the code? What would that yield? If we were to have extra money, and then what would we be getting for from what's in the municipal code right now? I think that, can you have that math for us by next week?
I'm loving the really. I'm loving all of the optimism of the additional funds that are being discussed right now, because I'm just gonna put that on the record.
We're an optimistic group.
I'm just gonna, and so we'll look at the fund balance, because the fund balance has grown for a multitude of reasons, from one-time funds, in addition to not being able to fill positions, a lot of cost savings if we weren't able or didn't need to spend money. Every single department in this city has minimized and tightened our belts. There's a reason that it's grown. And so because we have this fund balance, and just historically, I'll state for the record, for everybody's, I just haven't been using, as the finance director, the budget stabilization in the manner of which it is stated in the code. There's been a lot of finance directors, and everybody has a different method and means. And that's part of this discussion, is bringing that back onto the table and using it as it has been discussed. So I think that we do need to go back and just look at those, evaluate what level of money would be going into that fund. It does, Councilmember Muhlenberg brought up a great point that the reserve does tie to those, when those funds roll together, even though they stand alone in our budget and they show separately, they do still account for, you can roll that together as your quote reserve of the 16% that it stands. Part of the conversation from extending forward from the our retreat is evaluating if we want to grow that reserve. And so that's part of how we're walking into this conversation, and just being careful with the language of the unintended consequences of keeping the 16%, which originally has gone from GFOA's best practice. So we want to make sure that we hold, I mean, at minimum that, and we're looking to grow it, but put the appropriate language so that we don't have an unintended consequence down the road. And so I think we do need to just take a minute to look at those buckets, maybe evaluate it with the dollars tied to them, and in order to continue between the general fund of what is staying in the true general fund as a balance. What we were discussing in the previous meeting right before this, the work session, was that there's, maybe you leave the reserve within that general fund. I brought up the cash flow situation of the property tax. That's your main revenue coming into the general fund. You want to be mindful of that because it comes in about the April, October timeframe. And yet, as we've previously discussed at Budget and Finance, there's a lot of costs that come in January 1. So there's a lot of moving parts to this discussion, and we want to make sure that we look at it and get it to where everybody's comfortable.
You got a bunch of hands down.
Oh, sorry,
No,
I'm
at the year.
doing some thinking, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mentioned this. I still would like to, if there is a way to capture that structural deficit in the budget. I think that it was something that, in talking to people through the levy process last time, that number was hard for people to wrap their head around and understand how all the pieces fit together. And if there was, and in my head, I'm thinking the budget stabilization fund, because it is straightforward to move money in and out of it on an administrative level rather than councilmanic action, to be able to say, you know, this is the revenue that we have coming in. The additional revenue that has to be set aside to cover the budget, the biennial budget that we've adopted, is set as with some buffer into one of the funds. And then for the reserve conversation, to me, that extra like month, 30 days or 60 days at half spend feels like something that the council ought to be involved. Like, it doesn't feel like a problem for me if it were in the council contingency fund, which I don't think that we're doing much with now, that then becomes that rainy day. Like, there's a problem. That 16% reserve is not going to be enough. We need backup. That it feels okay that it would take council action because that would be such an extraordinary circumstance. I may be wrong though.
No, I'm,
I see
Yeah.
Councilmember Good's hand
Yes,
behind you.
So,
and then you had your hand up as well. So I'm gonna
yeah,
go
go ahead.
here.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Phil, did you want to step in now? I hear
Yes.
you got your hand.
I would, I want to redirect us away from this idea that we have money in these current budget years to put money into a budget stabilization fund. If you remember, Director Vaughn gave you the 6-year financial forecast at the retreat. And what that showed is our revenues are exceeded by expenditures by about $2.2 million a biennium, just over $1 million a year. So what we're talking about right now is you're sitting on reserve at the end of this biennium around $8.5 million. 16% of that's just of your revenues, the way we do it today, is about $2 million. So you have $6.5 million to play with. So if you just do the quick math of $6.5 million left, if you take today's ending fund balance or beginning fund balance, you've got about 2.5 biennium before you're at your 16%. So I think there's two discussions, and that's why we're putting this spreadsheet together that we have to have. First is, how do you go forward considering that the levy failed and assuming that another, that you don't go out for a levy or you go out for another levy and it fails again? And what do you do? How can you use those dollars to your advantage, maybe to say, buy down the rate that you might need to ask, the voters for? So just to back up, I think we're getting into the weeds of, we have lots of money and we can set aside this budget stabilization. We first need to have the discussion of how we get through the next 6 years if nothing changes.
And
I
just
don't agree.
to be clear, I hope that I was clear with what I was saying,
You
but
were,
that I'm trying to sort of symbolize that through the way that the funds would be set up to, I hope it didn't come across that I was trying to talk about new revenue coming into that, but that it really is just recognizing those buckets that already exist conceptually in, I think, all of our heads.
Yeah, I just wanted to put it out there for the public that might be listening, those in the audience, just that, we're kind of talking about two different things. The world as it exists today, the reality, and then a future. What if a levy passed? How would you structure your budget to be more resilient?
Yeah, I mean, we will be facing the structural deficit every biennium going forward, as far as we can tell.
I know you were next, Paul. Is it all right if I just make a comment?
Go ahead,
Thank
jump
you.
in.
I appreciate those comments, City Administrator Hill. The way I'm looking at this is we put a levy out there. It failed. A lot of the dialogue I had with people is, I don't understand why we're asking for a levy when there's such a large balance in this general fund that we have. So I really think this conversation is about illustrating to the public the policies that we have by appropriately tagging dollars to say, although we know we're going to have to spend these in 6 years, we're appropriately tagging them as dollars that should be in the stabilization fund and shouldn't be part of the conversation about what do we need to do to stabilize so we never need to get to that. Like those dollars should be there because we've got a mathematical formula here that tells us how to put dollars into that account. And by so doing, we then signal to the public that we are following the policy that the city has had. And in fact, those dollars we said we were going to set aside for you, they are primarily in this account following this formula that we are directed to use by the statute. And that to me is the communication that we're trying to do through this. I fully understand that we're a mess in 5 years and we got to do something about that.
And just to follow up on your comment, that's exactly what I've done in the spreadsheet is how much can you put into budget stabilization but realizing that you're paying for that deficit every year of those 6 years. And yeah, it is just showing how the math all works. So yeah, we're all talking the same thing.
But just to clarify, it's the budget stabilization fund and the budget reserve minimum. So there's two different line items, but those total together is what equals the budget reserve fund, correct? The amount. So if it's 16%, the 16% would be the total of what's in the reserve and what's in the budget stabilization fund. Right?
I don't like the word reserve fund because there is no such thing as a reserve fund. There's a reserve threshold.
Okay.
And what you said is exactly right. Doesn't matter which of those accounts they're in, as long as they're general fund dollars and we're above the 16%, we've achieved our threshold.
Because I think your theory was that we could just, I think we're restricted by that amount. I mean, by what the formula for the budget stabilization fund is. So I don't think that that's something that you can go in and out of very easily.
So if you begin the 27-28 biennial budget with the projected $8.5 million, you need to consider that just over 2 million of that you need to hold for that 16%.
Yeah.
And that gives you $6.5 million. If you want to hold higher than that, because your target is 24%, that's another $1 million. So you've taken 3 million off of that 8.5, you now have $5.5 million that you can use to balance your budget. Because I think the one thing that we stated is, this shouldn't be used for deficit funding. Well, we're already there. Our revenues already do not meet our expenditures.
So now we're just trying to come up with a reasonable plan that hopefully we can come up with. What? Deputy Mayor.
And one last thing, it seems like you're trying to put together the agenda for the Budget and Finance meeting, and so
You
there's,
noticed.
yes, there's that whole other thing about whether we go state revenue based or we go to expenditure based. So I think
Mhm.
that's an important discussion to have as well.
Yes, yes, and I think we all are very interested in having that policy discussion of what do we base the 16% on,
Exactly.
revenue or expenditure,
Or whatever is greater.
or whichever is
Or
greater.
whatever's greater, right?
Okay, so
Do you have what you need?
I think I've got what I need. I think we've discussed some options and ways of thinking about it, and then we will hopefully have a spreadsheet to be able to test those options out on the real numbers and see what it looks like. And I think that'll help us clarify the direction that we may want to go. But I think this is what I need to get to next Tuesday or next Thursday.
Thank you. And thank you, council, for a great discussion. I think it was important that we have this little, leftover bit from the work session, because it's really important that these discussions can get so easily out of hand that as long as we constrain ourselves to talking about certain things, we stay focused and we're able to basically make better policy. So thank you very much for all of your work.
And I
Okay.
will turn over to you in a more formal
All
fashion
right, thank
from here
you.
on out.
I appreciate that, Budget and Finance Chair. All right, so we have Council Committee reports. Does any council member, this is a mixture of both your, if you are a liaison to a committee and any outside bodies you're talking to. All right, go ahead.
Want me to go first?
Council- Yeah.
Three things from the past 2 weeks. The Regional Pool Coalition Committee, I'm not sure what their formal name is. We met last week, was very small attendance. We had 4 people turn out for it. I was the only representative from Lake Forest Park. Briar was there, Shoreline was there, and Edmonds was there. But really interesting, sort of, I'd say, very early stage conversations about bringing pools back into our communities. And I learned a lot. I can't remember the name of the initiative, but there was an initiative back in the 70s to build a bunch of pools. The reason we're in this problem is because all of those pools are expiring at the same time. So now I've answered the question I've always wondered, which is why are all our pools closing all at once? Well, it's because we built them all at the same time, and they have roughly a 50-year life, and then they need to go away. Anyhow, very, very interesting group. Shoreline is going forward with an initiative to build I think it's a $90 million facility up by their city hall. They're looking at opportunities to fund that through bonds and debt. I'm not sure that they will get the support that they're looking for. So there's also discussion about a regional park district that may form, which can fund pools. I'd love to have a session at some point where we talk about pools and what our own policy is as a city, because the discussion that's happening at the Regional Pool Committee is we build one large facility that meets multi-needs and supports regional pool activities that there's so much demand for in this region. Or do we build a whole bunch of smaller pools that also support a lot of the regional aquatic activity that we have in this region, but do it on smaller scale for individual teams as opposed to competition, as well as rehab and general public use? One of the things I'm personally trying to insert into the conversation is also dialogue about climate adaptation and the importance of pools as cooling centers as the earth gets hotter. Read a really interesting academic study after the meeting that talked about how on any given day when the temperature goes up 1 degree, pool attendance is 8% higher than it was the day before when the temperature was a degree cooler. So gives you a sense of the impact of a 1 centigrade change in temperature on how many people are showing up to use these pool facilities. So very early discussion, super excited about what's happening there. Thrilled to be part of that conversation. Raya 8, Paula and I today had a great briefing from the Raya 8 team. It was just an overview of what they do and what they focus on. Is it Chinook or Cohos? Chinooks. They're focused on the Chinook salmon recovery. Raya 8 is the largest watershed in the west side of the Cascades watershed. So super fun to get briefed on that. I'm going to be out of town for the next session, so Paula will be our representative at the meeting that they're holding next week, which is on the 19th. That's their formal meeting. And then the last thing is the Third Place Commons breakfast. I know I saw a couple of you there. What an amazing event. What an asset to our community the Third Place Commons are. Always a lot of uncertainty when we have change in ownership in the mall on what that's going to mean for Third Place Commons. I don't think there's any concerns that have been raised here today, but being at that event reminded me about what an impact it has on our community and how important it is. 27,000 people we drew into that space in the last year to attend events that are funded by the activity that happened at the auction. So the thing I want to say about that breakfast is we've gone several years. This was the first year, and I talked to Celia about this on my way over. This is the first year where roughly half of the people in the audience were first timers at the event. It's usually a bunch of very loyal, dependable supporters that are there. I think that's a really important statement to notice. More than 50% were first time attendees. That means that that facility and the auction and the fundraiser resonated with a much larger set of our community. And I was getting last minute calls from people saying, I forgot to buy my ticket. I didn't think it was going to sell out. I haven't missed it in years. Do you still have a seat at your table? So that's super exciting. And I don't want to let any cat out of the bag, so I'm not going to share any numbers, but I heard that it's the largest fundraising year they've ever had at the event. So super incredible. And thank you to everybody that was there and participated. Thank you.
Very cool. Thanks for the report. Appreciate it. Yeah, in fact, I think Councilmember Dembowski said, that he's our county council member, of course, said that he was told by his predecessor that this is the one event you must not miss. So it's, you know, we have some clout.
Amazing.
Yes. Anybody else have a report? Vice Chair.
Yeah, a couple of quick ones. The tree board met last week. They were disappointed to hear that we lost our arborist. Though they were happy to hear that we will be hiring a new urban forest planner who will be starting soon. We'll be starting next week. One of the things is they were doing some planning for the Green Fair, how they're going to be engaging with the community there at the Green Fair, maybe some sort of tree raffle or something like that. And they also passed some housekeeping amendments to the tree code. You might recall that last year they passed some changes to the diameters for what counts as an exceptional tree. That is going to be pending before us once we get a new urban forest planner. But they also passed some housekeeping changes. These are relatively minor things like not having a specific date on the tree list, or making it so that the urban forest planner and the tree board can change the tree list without needing council approval, since it's really more of an administrative task. So the plan and what they approved last week was to bundle with the tree code, with the tree diameter code, and bring it to us as a package. Though I think that'll be pending bandwidth from the new urban forest planner. Also last week was the Seashore Transportation Forum meeting. Relatively light because the city of Shoreline was having their annual retreat, and so a third of our attendance was gone. Mainly we got an update from Sound Transit about the Crosslink connection, the enhanced 2-line service from Linwood all the way to Redmond will be opening up at the end of this month.
Amazing.
Also updates, one of the changes is you can now pay by credit card. This is modern technology. A lot of other transit systems around the world use this, but you don't need an ORC card anymore. When you board the bus or the train, you can just tap your credit card and it'll keep track for transfer purposes.
That's good.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, Councilmember Risno.
Wanted to update from our last meeting. We adopted the ICE resolution. I wanted to mention that since then, Alberto Gutierrez Reyes and Emmanuel Clifford Damas have both died in ICE detention. So those are names that we can add to the next round of things. Unfortunately, I also corresponded with the county prosecuting attorney's office and just sent a copy of the resolution and asked if there were other things that we should be doing to coordinate with them, support the work that they're doing, make sure that they have the resources that they need to move prosecutions forward, as we had public comment requesting. And they felt like what we had in that resolution, what we have in policy, gives them what they need as things stand. Legislature, I think the mask bill just was signed today or yesterday.
Today.
So there's going to be new policy flowing out of that, and we will be able to circle back on that. There was no planning commission meeting this week because we've been very busy. I've been watching the hearing examiner process. 9 days of hearings, long days, and it was as a observer, I was really proud of our city staff, and it was having been on the Parks Board before and seen some of that park process from the other end. Just a real reminder of how far we've come with that, and just the knowledge and the skill and the dedication of all of this. I mean, a ton of Director Hoffman's staff wound up speaking or participating in the process. Attorney Pratt was amazing, and if I ever have occasion to be deposed, I know who I want sitting next to me and not across from me. Just really, really remarkable advocacy, legal advocacy, and knowledge, and the testimony from the consultants as well. Just the pride with which people spoke about the work that has gone in over all of that time, and the really hard work from the city staff over many, many years. And I think we can all be really proud and thankful for the work that's gone into that. So thank you.
Here, here. Thank you. All right. Anyone else? Okay, well, I'll deliver mine. I was able to attend the SCA PIC, that's this Sound Cities Association Policy Issues Committee. And I want to congratulate Vice Chair Goldman on now becoming the full member of the Regional Transit Committee as opposed to an alternate.
You know, funnily enough, no one told me that I was going to be at the meeting. No one told me that I was being considered for promotion.
Surprise.
You're welcome. All right. But we did actually have some serious matters to discuss. And what took up almost the entire time of the meeting was that the King County Transportation Benefit District is considering a sales tax increase. If they only do 0.1%, it's councilmanic to the Transportation Board's Board of Directors, which in fact is the membership of the King County Council. So they're thinking about taking it up in their April meeting, which would give us very little time to comment, which is why there was an emergency vote essentially. And to reach the threshold of even debate, we had to hit 85% of the 33 cities that were in attendance. We hit it easily. Everybody wanted to talk about this. So what we ultimately decided, and after this is, I call it a Robert's Rules nightmare because people were making, calls for the question and that kind of stuff and all that stuff. But nevertheless, ultimately, the policy position that we landed on, which is being recommended to the board to approve, is that we acknowledge there's a tax burden. And so in general, basically, we're happy not to add to the tax burden. However, if basically they choose to act on it, that the cities should get a significant amount. And the final figure we landed on was 25% of the revenues that were raised by that tax, which is estimated to be about 101 million per year, to come back to the cities for their use to basically improve roads. Primarily why this tax is being asked for by the county is because you may not have noticed, but the county roads are actually not in great shape, especially out towards East County. And so the Road Services Division is actually going bankrupt, which is why they need this influx of cash. So the idea was that about 2/3 of the raised revenue would go towards the Road Services Division, about 1/3 would go to KC Metro. And of course, KC Metro would use it to improve transit services. However, basically, it was that fact that there was nothing in it for the cities, and we are having our own issues, as you all know, that this would basically be in the similar vein as the Parks Levy had earmarked some of the money for the cities. This would be the same way there'd be an earmark for the cities because of this tax. And so finally, we approve that, and it's going to the board, and hopefully, and I think the executive director of SCA said that, yeah, in fact, he's already getting calls from King County council members, so this is a good sign. So stay tuned on that. All right. I'm also asked that the thing that got displaced out of the meeting was literally this discussion on potential affordable housing regional initiative. And it's again another tax. And I don't have the details on it, but here are the questions that I wanted to pose to you. Again, I don't need the answers tonight, but over the next few weeks, and I want members of the public to think on this too. So what are the potential opportunities that come with this initiative? This is the initiative that says that feasibility and fundamentals of a potential affordable housing levy. The details are kind of sketchy, but they're thinking about planning for a 2027 or 28 ballot. So want to start thinking about basically things like, what are the potentials if we had some money from the county to promote affordable, and this is small A affordable, not large A affordable. The distinction being large A affordable comes with you have to be below a certain percentage, the mean county income, that kind of thing, right? Small A affordable is what most of our folks basically think of it when we think of affordable. All right. The other question what are the potential barriers or challenges that come with this initiative? Clearly, it adds to the tax burden, but still, the question is, what are the trade-offs, right? For this levy to be seen as a success or adding value to your city, what would the levy need to achieve? So again, think of what the local effect might be. And then beyond the need for more funding, what are additional barriers to building affordable housing in your committee, which is pretty much right in the Planning Commission's wheelhouse, right? So, and then how can let's see, what do these guys write? The HDC, which they didn't actually explain that acronym, sorry. It's the committee that's associated with it, and regional partners best engage with cities throughout this process. And I know Councilmember Good, you're basically keen on outreach whenever somebody's asking for something like this, making sure that we understand what it's about. So something that it may be basically something you want to have a say on. So I'll take all your answers back to the April meeting of the SCA pick, and put our 2 cents in. For those of you not aware, the Sound Cities Association is the group of 38 cities in King County that are not Seattle. And so to try to even have sort of a voice in both state and county legislation, the group called the Policy Issues Committee was formed out of that. And every city gets an equal vote. So we have the same vote as Shoreline, who are significantly bigger than us, and Redmond and Bellevue and cities like that. So it's our chance to actually stick up for our city a bit. All right, so I also attended the deputy mayor's meeting at, just this morning. And one of the things that I found out was I cannot believe the number of cities that are building a public works yard or building. I mean, let's see, Burien, Federal Way, Covington, Black Diamond, they're actually going for a city campus. Kenmore's digging for geothermal. So yeah, this is just some amazing stuff going on, making a metropolitan parks district and stuff like that. So these are ideas that I think what the cities are all realizing is that just with basically the sheer number of regulations we have now, we just need more city staff. And once we have city staff, as we have seen here, you start outgrowing your own campus, whether it be the public works or even City Hall itself. So we're not in that boat by ourselves. So we need to talk to other cities and find out how we can actually try to, what is the word? Use economies of scale basically to try to not have to grow quite so fast. The other thing was that I did mention that since both Shoreline and Kenmore were in attendance, this idea from our traffic studies that any changes to traffic cameras on 104 or 522 would lead to a huge increase in work for our courts. In fact, it would just overwhelm our courts. And the idea of having a regional court system, so something larger than municipal, but lower than county or less than county, I think basically it actually had some traction. And I'll be talking to, who is it? The Auburn deputy mayor about basically they're starting up such a thing. So it'll be interesting to see what their experience is on that. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for my part. I did talk to the mayor. He apologized for not being here tonight, but he is quite sick, so we wish him well. I don't think we have to excuse him, right?
No.
Okay, that's fine.
No
Okay.
excuse for
Okay,
the
there's no
mayor.
excuse. But he had nothing to add in terms of a report, so I'll just turn it over to the city administrator and see if he has a report.
I already told you about the arborist beginning on Monday, so that's good news. The only other thing I have is, thankfully, the legislative session ends this evening. And Shelley Helder, our legislative lobbyist, will be here on the 26th to give you a end of session report. Well, she'll be on virtually. She has other commitments and can squeeze us in. So stay tuned. We'll see what comes out of tonight. Start taking a look tomorrow, see how things landed. They've been playing with traffic cameras, so stay tuned. See what they do with that revenue.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Okay, is there anything for the good of the order? All right, then I'm going to declare, or I'll accept a move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you, council. Thank you, staff. Appreciate it very much. Thank you, audience, for sticking around with us. All right.